Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to the members from the Drummers from Home. They are Robert Leake, Khalifa Jallo Hamilton, and Sobeys Benjamin for calling us together and really setting the rhythm and the tone for the evening. So let's give them another hand. My name is Lindsay Ruck, and on behalf of the Restorative Lab at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University and the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Transformative Journeys for Racial Justice panel. We'd like to begin by thanking all of you for helping to take care of one another and our panelists by masking this evening. This event is being live streamed and recorded, so please take a second now. Everyone, put your phone on silent. We also ask that you do not record the panel on your own devices. There are 2 photographers documenting the evening, as well as a video recording, which will be posted for public viewing. Please do feel free, however, to share on social media about this gathering and the important conversation about justice transformation and racial justice that will be happening this evening. We'll be using the hashtag Transformative Journeys. The program for tonight, with further information about the participants, can be found on the Restorative Lab's website or by using the QR code, which is on, right there, on the slide behind me. Tonight, we are meeting on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples, who have cared for this land and know the importance of living justly with the land and with one another. We are grateful for this wisdom and for the opportunity to gather here. I'd like to now invite Elder Jerry LeBlanc on stage, and if you are able to stand, please do so now.
Thank you very much. Lights are really bright. If it's impossible for you to stand, please, or if it's hurting you to stand, you can sit down. It's not necessary to stand just because I'm going to say a prayer. When I say the prayer, I've been given the honor of offering you all a prayer. But when I say the prayer, I pray to my Creator. Now, I know that everyone doesn't have the same Supreme Being as I do. So I invite you to listen to how I pray, what I say, and I ask you that, or I invite you that you might want to talk to who it is you pray to. So I'm going to say the prayer. Great Spirit and good Creator of all things, Aninzigwa, Indisni Cosmos Guiganukwe, Makwa Indodem, Nagawe Anishinaabe Kwe Kisagus, Gizolk, Kichimanitu, Great Spirit, we honor you with this prayer. We acknowledge your gifts of life and knowledge. We direct our attention to the life forces on Mother Earth. We give thanks for all we have, our food, our water, air, shelter, and so many beautiful beings who are our brothers and sisters. We give thanks for the gifts of the Two-Spirit people and the teachings they share. We give thanks to the rivers and streams which supply us with water, and to all herbs which furnish medicines to help us cure our illnesses and diseases. We give thanks to the moon and stars, which have given us their light when the sun is gone. We give thanks to the sun that has looked up upon the earth with a beneficent eye. Creator, we give thanks to those who have given of themselves to ensure we continue to live the good life we lead. We give thanks for the many people in this gathering who are eager and willing to help those who are not treated with respect and courtesy. Gizolk, we ask the actions that are taking the lives of innocent people to be stopped. We ask that we all live according to the directions given to us at birth. Creator, we ask that your Spirit dwell within each one present and help them listen with open hearts and open minds as they listen to the teachings. We pray that we can work together to find ways to support each other. Kichiminitu, we pray for the good of our nations, our communities, our families, our elders, leaders, and medicine people. We pray for those who give of themselves to protect the freedoms we enjoy. Great Spirit and good Creator, we ask these things in a good way, so that the steps we take will become the path of peace for our future generations. All my relations, Sitnokmak, Tahoe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elder Jerry. And before I turn it over to our panel, we would like to start this evening by acknowledging those who have partnered with the Restorative Lab and the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia in making this evening possible. And there are quite a few acknowledgements, so just stick with me on this one, okay? Well, tickets for the event were free. We are collecting donations in support of the important work of our partner, the Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland, Nova Scotia. If you did not have an opportunity to donate already, donations can still be made through the link on our program. The Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland Nova Scotia is a non-profit charitable organization devoted to improving the lives of marginalized groups of identified women, girls, non-binary, and gender-diverse individuals who have been let down by broken systems that perpetuate inequality. Their services aim to break the cycles that lead to criminalization by offering critical supports for transitional housing, programming both in jail and in the community to help develop essential life skills, and a range of court navigation services to provide underserved communities with the access to justice they deserve. EFRI Nova Scotia has been a long-standing advocate for restorative alternatives to incarceration to address systemic gender discrimination in federal and provincial correctional facilities in Nova Scotia. We are also grateful for the important collaboration and support from the Victims of Institutional Child Exploitation Society, which is also known as Voices, the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Program, and the Criminal Justice Coalition at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, the Office of the Vice Provost Equity and Inclusion at Dalhousie University, and the Black North Initiative. Finally, this evening would not have been possible without the generous support from Sobeys Inc, Justice Canada's Justice Partnership Innovation Program, and the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie. This public panel is part of the National Restorative Collaborative Learning Conference. They're making me work for these words tonight. Woo! That has been meeting here in Halifax over the past 3 days to explore the significant potential for restorative justice to bring real and lasting transformation to the ways in which we do justice within the legal system, but also broadly across systems, sectors, and in communities. It makes sense that Nova Scotia would play host to such an important collaborative gathering, given its long-standing commitment to restorative justice and creating pathways for this approach to justice for Nova Scotians. It also makes sense that this important conversation tonight take place here in Nova Scotia. Having resided in the region for over 400 years, African Nova Scotian contributions to Nova Scotia and Canada began over 150 years before Canada became a country. African Nova Scotians came to the province through enslavement or through fleeing enslavement elsewhere, and continue to experience all manners of structural, systemic, and individual discrimination. Until 1961, more than half of all Black people in Canada were African Nova Scotian. The province of Nova Scotia identifies African Nova Scotian as a founding culture. There has been significant work done in the province by African Nova Scotian leaders working for racial justice that have resulted in significant transformation of justice, including the work of the former residents of the Home for Colored Children, which resulted in the restorative inquiry and the first government apology for systemic racism. Also to note is the establishment and work of the Indigenous, Black, and Mi'kmaq Initiative at the Schulich School of Law, and the recent establishment of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute. This evening, yes. When you clap, I get to take a breath, so let's keep clapping. This evening has been designed so that we can learn from 3 incredible beacons in the journey for racial justice in the United States and internationally. As we do this, we hope it will lead us to further recognize and celebrate those in our midst here in Nova Scotia and across Canada who are on similar transformative journeys. We also hope it will inform and inspire us all for the journey ahead as we confront and address systemic racism and seek justice in its place. We will be guided on our journey this evening by two narrators, Ms. Kai Butterfield, who was a fellow of the Restorative Lab last year and is pursuing a PhD at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and Mr. Jake McIsaac, an associate of the Restorative Lab, who is Assistant Director of Security Services at Dalhousie University and a leading figure in restorative justice in Nova Scotia. Thank you. They will help set the stage for the panelists' reflections about the different eras or epochs of their justice journey. They will focus the discussion in 4 parts this evening before sitting down with the panel to facilitate questions offered by people involved with our core collaborating partners. Jennifer Llewellyn, who is director of the Restorative Lab, will moderate the discussion amongst our panelists. To learn more about our panelists, please see the panel program at the QR code still right behind me. We are about to embark on an evening completely devoted to the intersecting biographies of the civil rights legends you see right here. So I will not delay, So I will not delay any longer introducing our panelists for this evening. Please join me in welcoming Angela Davis, Margaret Burnham, and you may note that Fania Davis is not on stage this evening. At the last minute, she was unable to travel to be with us. She expressed her deep disappointment with missing this chance to be here with all of you, and of course, with Angela and Margaret. But she did not want to be absent from the discussion, and we are so grateful for that. So she has responded to the questions on video and will be included with the reflections this evening. Okay, are we ready? I am done. Please welcome Jacob and Kai.
This evening, it is our distinct pleasure to frame the justice journeys of Fania Davis, Angela Davis, and Margaret Burnham. These deeply relational journeys have spanned across space and time, beginning in Birmingham, Alabama during the early 1940s. In this thoroughly segregated context, anti-Black violence was a quotidian reality that necessitated political resistance. The panelists' parents, Dorothy and Louis Burnham, and Sally and Frank Davis, were active members of the civil rights movement. They made major contributions to Birmingham's rich history of organizing and resistance, but this work often had dire consequences. Bull Connor, Birmingham's so-called Commissioner of Public Safety, continuously threatened the Burnham family until they were forced to move to New York in 1949. The panelists witnessed the surveillance and harassment that their parents endured, particularly due to their communist affiliations, but they also watched their parents build supportive community across cities that bolstered the fight for racial justice. As children, the panelists followed their parents' example by playing games that incorporated resistance to anti-Black racism and refused the conditions of segregation in Birmingham. Angela has recounted running across the street to swiftly touch the porches or ring the doorbells of Ku Klux Klan members. These playful, risky, and disruptive tactics represent early efforts to maintain their dignity and sense of self in the context of injustice.
As activists pushed to desegregate the area, Bull Connor fomented violence through media, and it led to many bombings in the community. This meant that when Angela and Fania's father, Frank Davis, heard strange sounds during the night, he would get up, take a gun, and go check the bushes around their home to ensure a pipe bomb had not been left outside by members of the KKK. Bombings were a routine expression of racial terror, especially in the South. So much so that the name of the area where the Burnhams and Davises lived and grew up was known as Dynamite Hill. On September 15th, 1963, the Ku Klux Klan murdered Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair by planting dynamite outside the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Angela and Fania knew these young girls personally, one of whom lived only about 100 feet or so away from their family home. This event and the daily violent responses to desegregation played a major role in the early politicization of the panelist, and they became acutely aware of the need for change. In the words of Sally Davis, "This is not the way things are supposed to be. Things will be different."
So we had the opportunity to ask Fania when she couldn't come the question I'm going to ask you afterwards. And so we'll hear Fania's answer, which was, if these are the early years, if these are the formative years, what did they teach you about injustice and about justice? And how did they form you in those early years? So that's what we asked. We asked Fania. We'll see if we can get her answer first before you respond.
Thank you, Jen, Kai, Jacob, and all the other organizers of this amazing conference. You are an unprecedented gathering of justice champions from all over Canada. Indigenous leaders and Indigenous students, the Black North Initiative, Voices, the Black Cultural Center, formerly incarcerated women, judges, representatives from all of Canada's provinces and territories, and deputy ministers of justice. Truly amazing. I also want to greet with gratitude the restorative justice and the truth and reconciliation movements of Canada. You are lighting the way for us here in the United States as we build our nascent truth and reconciliation movements and our restorative justice movement. So what did we come to understand about justice as children? Our native city was called Birmingham because of pervasive racial violence. Our neighborhood was called Dynamite Hill because Black families were targeted for daring to push the color line by moving into this previously all-white neighborhood. The bombing that brought world condemnation, of course, was the Birmingham Sunday School bombing of 1963 that killed 4 Black girls. Yet there were many other terroristic attacks, less well known. For example, the firebombing of our church just a few blocks away from our home, the bombing of the homes of activists and leaders like Arthur Shores, Attorney Shores was a civil rights lawyer who was a family friend, and he, together with the great Thurgood Marshall, brought comprehensive and powerful litigation to bring down the walls of segregation. As a result, racial terrorists bombed Attorney Shore's home 4 times, and he took to sitting on his porch with a shotgun to protect his family. So what was the impact on us? How were these events formative for us? Well, at first, of course, the bombing that was most personally and deeply impactful for me was the Sunday school bombing, because I lost 2 close friends in that bombing. And beyond the bombings, we were impacted by having to move through Birmingham's profoundly segregated landscape every day of our lives, every moment of our lives. We were impacted by the pervasive social messaging that you're inferior because of the color of your skin. You're subhuman. You don't deserve well-resourced schools. You don't deserve good jobs. You don't deserve to live in nice neighborhoods with nice homes. We were impacted by the colored and white signs that were ubiquitous and that were the first words we learned to read. And I add, we move through a landscape of resistance, above all in our homes and in our communities. Our father banded with other fathers in the neighborhood in armed self-defense. Our mother embodied resistance so powerfully that she helped us imagine new worlds, new ways of living. She always said, it doesn't have to be this way, children. We can change it. I want to share an anecdote here. She and I were in a downtown department store one day, and she completed her purchase and was paying the young white man standing at the counter. He returned the change to her, and as he gave her the change, he said, "Here you go, Sally. Here's your change." And my mother paused. She looked him straight in the eye. And she said, "I have you know my name is Mrs. Sally Davis, and if you can't call me by that name, I am happy to take my business elsewhere." She was always defiantly asserting her equal moral worth and dignity, demonstrating it, showing us we were witnessing it, always firm, always unyielding. The Burnham family also embodied resistance. Margaret's parents were Black radicals who came south to do anti-racist organizing until threats of violence from the police commissioner himself, Bull Connor, forced them out. Resistance was all around us too in the marches, demonstrations, and protests of the time. Actually, other forms of resistance, not so obvious, were the games that we routinely played. We were forced to climb the back stairs and sit in the Blacks-only balcony of the local cinema. And so our way of protesting was to throw popcorn and Coca-Cola and pour Coca-Cola onto the white heads below. Another game was that we sat on the grass in our front yard, which was at the apex of Dynamite Hill. We yelled out epithets and threw stones when cars passed by with white people inside. And it's a wonder we didn't suffer retaliation or even lynching for that. Angela will share many more about our games. The point is that we got immense joy and laughter and satisfaction from rebelling and resisting in these ways. For me at that time, justice required freeing my people from the yoke of racial terror and racial apartheid. For me at that time, justice required a world where no child would lose her life while praying at Sunday school. I didn't name it then, but with the benefit of hindsight and reflecting on our games, for us, I believe justice also required joy.
So Fania said you'd tell us more stories, but about what those years of your life taught you about injustice and by the same token about justice and what it requires.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. And I'm really happy to be here in Halifax once again. I have wonderful memories of my last two visits, and I had the opportunity to explain to Margaret today who Viola Desmond was, and all of the history of struggle in this area. I think I mentioned when I was here before that I had heard about Africville in the early 1970s as a result of hearing an album by Faith Nolan. Yes. Now, I was wondering whether I should follow Fania. Well, I suppose I should, because I can elaborate on some of the answers she gave. But first of all, I want to tell Margaret how how honored I feel. Margaret is, perhaps my oldest friend, and I say that because we have known each other since before we were born. Because our mothers were pregnant. She's a little older, a little young.
What a joke.
That's the joke, because she always reminds me that I am substantially older than she is. I'm actually, the Burnham family had the same number of children as the Davis family, and we each had our counterparts. And Margaret's sister Claudia, who's a little older than I am, was my counterpart. My brother, Ben, was Margaret's counterpart. And my sister Fania had Linda on the Burnham side, and my brother Reggie had Charles on the Burnham side. So I should tell you that even though Margaret's parents, and by extension the children in the family, were forced to flee Birmingham as a consequence of threats that were issued by Bull Connor, we remained very close. I think I was 5 years old the first time I went to New York to spend time with them. And later my mother went to graduate school at NYU, and we always spent the summers with the Burnhams. Now later, when I became an academic, I asked myself, how was it possible for my mother to do graduate work in a house with at first 6 children, then 8 children, but she managed it. But I want to thank Margaret's family for introducing radical activism into my family. Dorothy and Louis. And one of the amazing things about that period was that as children, we got to call the adults by their first names. Because that was the practice in radical circles. So Margaret's father and mother were members of were organizers for the Southern Negro Youth Congress. They were communists. And as a matter of fact, Margaret will talk more about the ways in which the works that they did during that period, during the late 1930s, the 1940s, actually created the terrain for the emergence of what we all know as the mid-20th century civil rights movement. There would have been no civil rights movement as we know it had not black communists and people who were willing to work with black communists done that important work. In 1949, I think it was 1949, that would mean that I was born in 1944. Yeah, I am a bit older than you, Margaret.
Don't forget it.
There was a conference in Columbia, South Carolina, organized by the Southern Negro Youth Congress, where W.E.B. Du Bois gave the keynote address. The title of that oration, and you can find it if you look it up online, was "Behold the Land." It's a wonderful speech. So I would urge you to read it and imagine how young people, young black radical activists in the South were inspired to do the work that they did. So I'm so thankful to the Burnham family for introducing my parents to the kind of radical activism that would shape our lives for many, many years to come. having said that, I will say, I mean, I tell the stories about the games we used to play all the time, because it was about having fun. But as children, we knew that we were violating the law. So we knew that we were challenging injustice, but we wove that into the games that we played so that it also became an occasion for the expression of joy. And, I remember many times, running across the street. I should explain, I don't think my sister did elaborate on that explanation. The segregation of the city of Birmingham was thorough and complete, to the extent that neighborhoods were zoned in an apartheid way. Black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods. And where they met, there was always a border. And we lived on the border of the black neighborhood. We lived in a recently zoned black area, just recently zoned black area. As a matter of fact, there were still some white people living on our side of the street. Eventually, of course, they all left. But on the other side, black people were not even allowed to walk on the sidewalk unless they were there for purposes of working for white people, engaging in some economic activity, being, a servant. And we knew that as children. And so we developed this game that was kind of like hide and go seek, or Simon Says, or something like that.
Simon Says.
So we would dare one person to run across the street into the territory that would have meant that we would have been jailed had we been caught. And we did that for a while, and then eventually we decided, well, if you're really bold, you can not only run across the street, but you can run up some white people's stairs and ring the doorbell and run back across the street. That was home, right? Home both in the sense of home, but home in the sense of hide and go seek.
Home base.
And make it back before they answered the doorbell. We did that all the time. And it was so much fun. And I always think of that as a lesson about the fact that doing this kind of activism does not have to be about sacrifice. People are always saying, thank you so much for your sacrifices. And I have to correct them and say that it's not all about sacrifice. It's about joy as well. It's about learning how to generate joy in the process of engaging in resistance. And actually, I think this is the gift that black people have offered the world. This is why black music is known on every continent of this planet. And it's an indication of the fact that black people learned how to create joy in the midst of oppression and suffering. And that the most important dimension is not the oppression and the suffering and the terror, which is, we have to know that. And of course, Margaret has written an amazing book about that history. But what is really remarkable is that black people learn how to create beauty in the process of challenging that oppression. And that is the gift that black people have offered to the world, I think. And I think that's the meaning of those little games, on the corner of Center Street and 11th Court when we were, 5 and 6 and 7 years old. I would say, and I think I'll just make one other comment because I forgot to pull out my phone so I can time myself so I don't speak too long. But what I think I want to say is that that I would not have wanted to grow up anywhere else. You know, despite the bombings and the efforts on the part of white people, not all white people, because there were white people who were allies in our community. You know, as a matter of fact, I can remember my mother had white friends, and if they went somewhere, the white person, and my mother was driving, the white person would always have to lie down on the back seat because it was illegal for black and white people to engage in social intercourse at that time. But I think I learned that you know, not only that it's possible to resist, but that one can have a sense of self-worth, and not only individual self-worth, but collective self-worth in face of the efforts on the part of white supremacists to persuade us repeatedly that we were inferior. And I think that Margaret's parents and the activists, my teachers, who in this segregated school tried to guarantee that we learned how to be proud of who we were. And I think I've carried that sense with me for all of my life. And that came out of a situation in which, you know, all of the institutions and the structures were designed to persuade white people that black people were inferior, but more importantly, to persuade us that we were worthless. And that was a message that we absolutely refused to accept.
So yes, good evening, and thanks to Elder Jerry for bringing us together in prayer, and for the drummers, and for the two interlocutors from Dalhousie, and a special thanks to Brother Russell from the Black Community Center, Cultural Center, where we gathered earlier today, and a very special thanks as well to Jennifer Llewellyn, Dr. Professor Jennifer, for all of her work in building community and in spreading the wisdom and the challenge of restorative justice, restorative institutions, and restorative processes, not just here in Canada, but really across the world. It's really a great honor and a pleasure to be here, and of course a very special pleasure to be here with my dear old friend Angela Davis, older friend Angela Davis, and my dear friend, even if virtual, Fania Davis. So what I pulled from first of all, both Angela and I were born we're old, so as she said, so we were born in the Schlossfield Hospital for Colored Women in Birmingham, Alabama. And the hospital was created out of an FDR program because so many African American women in Birmingham were losing their babies. And so it was brand new, opened in 1940, and we were born a few years thereafter. And what I want to pull out of what Angela and Fania have just said is how critically important it is to plant the seeds, and how the seeds that were planted really back when our parents began their work have flowered in some way and have brought us here to join you in community today. So my father, let me start with my father, whose parents came to the United States as immigrants, and he grew up in a very small Barbadian community in Harlem, and he went to City College, and there he got radicalized, and he learned about socialism in the early 1920s, and he learned about communism, and he studied in an area. He used to tell me about an area in City College where there were 4 pillars in this common area. And the socialists would gather in one under one pillar, and the communists under another pillar, and other left groups under the other. And they wouldn't talk to each other. But that's what introduced him to the idea that there was a different world out there. My mother was a student at Brooklyn College, where many of her professors, this is the 1930s, were socialists and communists. And she became interested in a very famous case, the Sacco and Vanzetti case. I'm sorry, the Scottsboro case, not or the later case, in the 1930s. And she was introduced to that case, a case of extreme racial violence in Alabama, a small town in Alabama. And she was introduced to the Scottsboro case by a mentor of hers at the local Brooklyn YWCA, who said to her, let's go on a picket line and protest the persecution/prosecution of the Scottsboro young boys and men. She went on that picket line. My father moved from pillar to pillar at City College, and the rest is really history. So once you plant that, they didn't come up in left families. They didn't come up knowing anything about radicalism from their parents. They knew, obviously, their parents were deeply engaged in, global African pride. One was a member of, my father's mother was in the Garveyite movement, but they knew nothing about the wider world out there. And it was through these contacts, these classrooms, these picket lines, that they decided in the 1930s, which we all know was the decade of protest. And they decided then that they wanted to join the socialists and become communists and join the communist movement. They did that. And then they made a second decision, which was to leave New York City and build the Southern Negro Youth Congress, and they had to decide where they were going to put it, or where they were going to go. And Birmingham was the choice they made because Birmingham was in movement at that time. Throughout the 30s, there had been a strong labor movement in Birmingham. There was activity in those mines on the hills surrounding Birmingham. It was an industrial city in the Deep South, deeply scarred by Jim Crow, but also in movement, in action. And that's where they went. And that's how our lasting and beautiful friendship among the three of us really started. I know we have a lot to cover, and we've talked for 40 minutes, so I'll stop now, but I will say, I will just say, yeah, it was that decade, the 30s. So, as we continue to engage wherever we are with a politic that will bring greater justice and greater humanity, greater peace, less war, to all of us, we're planting seeds that may not sprout in our own generation, but at some point they will sprout. I want to tell one other story before I leave. And Angela mentioned that her family would come to visit us in New York when my parents were kicked out of Birmingham by Bull Connor and by the deep anti-communism that was taking root across our country during the Truman years in 1948. And that cemented the friendship of our families. Now, there was a reason why Sally Davis, a penultimate teacher, just a brilliant classroom teacher, came up to New York to further her education. She wanted a master's degree in education. She could not get one in Alabama because all of the master's programs in Alabama were segregated. And she wasn't going to a segregated master's program. And so she had two choices. She could either go to a black master's program, and they were not the best programs, or Alabama could pay her to go to a program outside of the state. Alabama was so disregarding of black intellectual talent that it sent its young adults outside of the state to become educated. And she chose New York because we were there and she knew there would be an open door for her four and our four kids in New York City. So it's, we haven't reflected on these moments, which are, accidental in so many ways, but also just so formative. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to do so with all you foreigners.
As each panelist progressed into adulthood, they continued the political education that would animate their relationships and drive their liberatory work. Margaret received a bachelor's degree in history from Tougaloo College in Mississippi and earned her law degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 1969. After attending Swarthmore College, Fania went to the University of California in San Diego to study philosophy. Angela attended Brandeis University in Massachusetts and spent her junior year in France. After graduating with honors from Brandeis, she went to Frankfurt, Germany to study philosophy and then returned to the University of California, where she taught in the philosophy department. In 1969, the University of California fired Angela for her membership in the Communist Party. During this time, police raided Fania's home, shooting her husband Sam, due to their political resistance and connection to Angela. Police charged Fania and Sam with attempted murder of a peace officer, but these charges were later dropped. Eventually, a court deemed Angela's firing from the University of California illegal. However, in 1970, UCLA fired her a second time for inflammatory language in speeches that called for the freedom of the Soledad brothers, George Jackson, John Cluchette, and Fleta Drumgo, political prisoners who had been indicted for the murder of a guard at Soledad Prison. That year, the FBI charged Angela with kidnapping and the murder of a judge in California due to a courtroom revolt during the Soledad brothers' trial. This revolt resulted in the death of a judge and multiple activists. Angela went underground, but was eventually arrested in New York City.
When Fania found out that Angela had been arrested, she immediately went to the Women's House of Detention in Greenwich Village. Fania organized an international campaign to free her sister. She spoke in front of thousands of people globally to raise awareness about Angela's political imprisonment. By leveraging the deep connection between Black liberation and socialism, she rallied the support of people who were already actively involved in liberatory work around the world. Margaret worked as part of the legal team that defended Angela and helped securing her release. She was one of the first 2 lawyers on the team. She took on this file while working a full-time job at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Margaret made regular visits to the jail to speak with Angela and continued to participate even when the trial moved to California from New York. Margaret was the only attorney to support Angela from the time of her arrest to the very end of her trial. Out of care for Angela, but also due to her deep commitment to the liberatory struggle. The relationship between Angela, Fania, and Margaret during the trial stands as a single example from this period of time of the way that radical work emerged from relationship. The eventual freedom of Angela Davis and other political victories of this era can be traced to people coming together across movements and sharing the daily work of revolutionary change.
So we asked Fania to reflect on that epoch, that era, those happenings, and she did. And then she sent us instructions about how to edit what she said, which is a chance you don't have. So if this seems a little edited, it's at her instruction. But let's hear what Fania said.
Well, that time was the 60s and the 70s. Was a time of ferment, rebellion, insurgency, revolution, radicalism. The colleges all over the country were hotbeds of activism around the Vietnam War in particular. And the civil rights movement was still happening, but it was being eclipsed, especially amongst youth, by the Black Power movement, and by Malcolm X, who basically felt that I don't want to integrate into this unjust system. We need a revolution. We don't need assimilation. We need transformation. I was active in my Black Student Union, and we took over the administrative building there. And our demands were to admit more Black students and hire more Black faculty. My husband at a neighboring, my then husband, I guess husband-to-be at a neighboring college, was also active in his Black Student Union, and he was arrested for his activism. We were inspired by the national liberation movements that were rising up in the global South to throw off the yoke of colonialism, whether in Cuba or North Vietnam or Africa with Lumumba and Nkrumah and Amilcar Cabral and, of course, Mandela and Kenya, and in South America, revolutionaries there. We had Marxist-Leninist study groups, and we truly believed that the revolution was coming. And I was thinking of going to Tanzania, I believe it was, or Zimbabwe to get urban guerrilla warfare training. We were getting ready for the revolution. And during that time, before Angela's arrest, my husband and I were arrested, and that police actually invaded our apartment because of our work with the Black Panther Party in California at that time. And they shot my husband and almost killed him. And it's just a miracle that he survived, because the bullet went into his shoulder and exited just millimeters from his spine. We finally, were able to get the charges dropped. A small movement organized around us, and the judge in that case found that the police had no business going into our apartment in the first place. It was a violation of our right to privacy, of our First Amendment right to political expression and freedom. And he ordered that the charges be dismissed against us. But the prosecutor in that case kept re-indicting us. I think by the end, he re-indicted us 3 times, and the judge dropped the charges 3 times. Then 6 months later, Angela was, of course, targeted by the then President Nixon and then Governor Ronald Reagan in the state of California on capital charges of murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping, which meant that if convicted, she would face the gas chamber. as I said, we were stone cold revolutionaries, and that's the way I responded to this attack on Angela. I knew without thinking about it that I had a duty to defend my sister. I was pregnant at the time. And so for the first, 9 months after Angela was captured, which was in October of 1970, I was pregnant. Nonetheless, I traveled all over the country and all over the world to organize internationally and nationally for her freedom. And I felt so affirmed and hopeful and positive, because all over the world, wherever I went, whether in Chile or other parts of Latin America, or in Italy or France or Germany or England, and other places in Europe and the Soviet Union at the time, many countries in the Soviet Union I visited as well. Everywhere I went, thousands of people, tens of thousands came out demanding Angela's freedom. In Paris, I remember at La Place de la Bastille, there were 60,000 people marching for Angela's freedom, demanding her freedom. Thousands, and if not tens and hundreds of thousands of young children in Germany were marching for Angela's freedom, and they started a campaign, I think 1 million flowers for Angela Davis, and this was a letter writing campaign where they wrote letters to Angela. And if you had been there at the jail, you would have seen the mailman come in with a big bag full of these letters on his back. And many of them were not even addressed. It just says to Angela Davis, and they got to her. I think these letters are in archives at Stanford University now. But I was just so confident. Because I could see the power of these movements, organized movements all over the world, I had no doubt that we would be victorious.
I wonder if, Margaret, we go to you first, because you would have some memories of that fierce fight on the legal side.
Well, what I would say is that Fania and I have agreed to disagree about this. It has always been Fania's view. Fania was out in the world, and as she says, traveling across our country, but as well elsewhere, venues worldwide, and was feeding off of the energy of the movement that we were creating. And so she was, and maybe she may have not said this until the verdict came in, but she has always said, I had no doubt. And I had a different perspective and continue to have a different perspective. And what I will say is that I don't believe in miracles, but Angela's sitting here because we fought for this and we won. If we had not done that, if we hadn't fought as hard as we did, and if Angela herself had not had the vision, the perspective, and also just the trust in the movement, and had not been able to fight for herself, this could have ended up differently. She could be continuing to give us her voice, but it would today be behind a wall of a jail, a prison. And so I was familiar with the forensic evidence and familiar with, I don't want to say overwhelmed by, but certainly aware of the power of the state here. and the determination and intent of the state that this was to come out differently. And so I knew what we were confronting. And I knew that the break that we had was when we were able to get Angela out on bail. And from that moment on, she was able to speak freely, and it was a form of release. She was able to speak more freely, to meet with her lawyers, to meet with perhaps most importantly, the small community of organizers, many of whom, may they rest in peace, have passed on, who dedicated those years of their lives to this case. And we did it not just because we knew the world needed her voice, but also because we were persuaded by our tagline, "Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners." And we knew that she was that voice as well. And that's what she's done ever since then. And the world is a different place because of it.
Well, I remember the evening when I was arrested. I was in New York City, and I was taken to the Women's House of Detention, which was at that time in the very center of Greenwich Village. Now, Margaret should have been the first person I saw after I was arrested. I found out later that she had immediately come to the jail when the news broke that I had been arrested. And she identified herself as an attorney, as my attorney, but they refused to believe that she was a lawyer. She looked too young. If you look at some of the pictures during that period, she really looked like she was about 15 or 16. And so they would not let her into the jail. She had to go back and retrieve her credentials, her bar card, before they would allow her to see me. But Margaret came down that evening, and she remained with the case as it moved from New York to California, from Marin County to Santa Clara County, until the very end. As a matter of fact, I'll never forget what it felt like to be sitting next to Margaret as the jury filed in to deliver their verdict. And I had so depended on Margaret, not only for her legal expertise, but also because she had been a part of the movement in the South, in Mississippi, Freedom Summer, 1964. So she was the person who really understood the meaning of mass movements. There were other attorneys. Howard was also an activist. Dobby.
Leo Branton.
Yeah, Leo didn't have that kind of grassroots experience. He was certainly an amazing attorney and had defended quite a few people, had served as the attorney for a number of people. But he didn't have that sense of the relationship between grassroots activism and the possibility of a legal victory. And that was, one of the things we talked about from the beginning to the end of the trial. Some of the lawyers assumed that, all we had to do is create the kind of defense that would win inside the courtroom. And there were others like Margaret who always insisted on a kind of dialectical relationship between what was happening in the streets all over the country, here in Canada, all over the world, and the possibility of a winning verdict. But like I said, Margaret and I were sitting right next to each other when the jury came in. Now, Margaret was trying to tell me to, well, my mother, now I remember, my mother did not want to come in. She was afraid. She did not want to be there in the event that the verdict was guilty. And so Margaret had to convince her to come into the courtroom, which she eventually did. So Margaret was consoling my mother. She was consoling me because we did not know what the jury was going to say. And just as the jury began to walk in, Margaret she had my hand. It was something like that. And when she kind of let out a quiet scream, and then, one of the people who's no longer with us that Margaret was referring to, Franklin Alexander, he started to sob.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, it was this really this moment that will be forever etched into my memory. It was a journey. It was a real journey, and there were moments when I felt optimistic, but there were many moments when I was convinced that no matter what we did, that the project of the state would prevail. And as I've said many times, who did we have? Who was the president of the United States? It was Richard Nixon. Who was the governor of the state of California? It was Ronald Reagan. And who was the head of the FBI? J. Edgar Hoover. So this was this triumvirate of power, the most powerful people in the world. And so now I like to point this out because the message of that victory was that we can win. Mm-hmm. We can win. And it was people all over the world. People here in Canada, a lot of activity was happening in this state. As a matter of fact, when I was underground, I was invited to, come to Canada, and I considered it. And other people said you should go to Cuba, but I decided that I did not want to be in exile for the rest of my life. And that it would be I did not know what the outcome would be, but we certainly learn that when people come together across all kinds of racial boundaries, class boundaries, national boundaries, that we can actually win. And there's so many stories I could tell. Fania told the story about the children in what was then the German Democratic Republic of the German Democratic Republic, developing a campaign that was called it was actually called A Million Roses for Angela. Eine Million Rosen für Angela. And so I meet people today who tell me what it was like being in elementary school at that time, writing a letter to me, and how it made them feel a part of something so large that it transformed them and helped to direct them, helped to create the trajectory for the rest of their lives. I'm going to tell one other story. I could tell a million stories. But by the way, they did send at least 1 million postcards in which children drew roses on one side and messages. As Margaret pointed out, was it Margaret or Fania?
Fania, the bags.
Fania said sometimes the letters that were just addressed to Angela Davis, USA. And we got thousands and thousands. I'm sure there must be at least 1 million, if not more, of those postcards. They're at Stanford now in the archives that the children sent. But the story that I wanted to tell has to do with meeting a Palestinian man in Jerusalem many, many years later, in 2011. And I told the story there of prisoners who had sent messages to me, messages that was smuggled out of prisons. In this particular case, it was a message smuggled out of an Israeli prison, signed by large numbers of Palestinian political prisoners. I described that in Palestine and how moving that was for me at that time. And then this man comes up to me who was probably in his 80s, a little bit older than I am now, and he said, I was one of the prisoners who signed that message. And it just, the fact that 50 years later, we could both meet and join hands in the struggle for justice, that was one of the most meaningful moments of my life. But I continue to think that if we do this work, if we come together, we can accomplish the impossible. And I'll say one other thing, and that it is our job to generate hope. It is our job to share with others the fact that we can achieve the impossible if we come together, if we organize, if we create a collective journey toward justice.
The work of justice transformation requires us to pay attention to the context, causes, and circumstances that contribute to injustice. George Jackson shared this fundamental requirement with Angela in a letter that asked her to expand her work beyond individual political prisoners to the disruption of the prison system itself. Immediately following her acquittal, the apparatus originally organized around her release shifted to the work of prison abolition more broadly. Angela toured the world, speaking about the connections between racism, gender-based discrimination, and carcerality. Her thinking also reflected her intellectual commitments to the transformative potential of socialist and communist theory. After the trial, Margaret became the first female African American judge in Massachusetts, where she sat until 1982. In 2002, she joined Northeastern University School of Law faculty. She also founded the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project in 2007. Through CRRJ, Margaret leads law students as they investigate acts of racial violence and the unsolved murders of Black people from the Jim Crow era.
Margaret's work grapples with the past through critical readings of the archives, which deliberately obscured Black people's voices and experiences of violence. Margaret's team prioritizes first voice by helping communities to develop oral histories of these violent events, recording important knowledge that often only exists in their memories. In many cases, the perpetrators and victims are dead, but this work remains important because, in her words, it surfaces the modalities of violence and methods of resistance. The work of CRRJ helps us to identify the continuities and discontinuities of anti-Black violence and reveals different forms of resistance, notably the quiet or not so quiet resistance of women. Ultimately, this work provides communities with information that fills the gap in their collective memories, allowing them to make sense of the past, seek justice in the present, and pursue a different way forward. After Angela's acquittal, Fania completed a law degree at the University of California and then practiced law as a civil rights lawyer for 27 years. She became burnt out by her work in law and activism because these spaces demanded personal qualities that Fania has described as hypermasculinist, hyperrational, aggressive, and warrior-like. This struggle led her to apprentice under a Zulu traditional healer in South Africa. Through this learning, she came to understand that seemingly opposing forces, law and spirituality, justice and love, resistance and rest, are not separate from one another when one's work is human-centered. Fania completed a PhD in African Indigenous Studies, and by returning to the legal sphere in the United States, she learned about restorative justice. In 2005, she founded Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, an organization that uses restorative justice to shift away from punitive responses to youth wrongdoing and disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline that perpetuates the mass incarceration of Black people. Ultimately, the ongoing justice advocacy of Fania, Margaret, and Angela represents the possibilities of challenging oppressive systems by pursuing justice that is underpinned by radical notions of time, community, and care.
So we described to Fania that we would describe your journeys after 1972 and the justice pathways you took from that time. And we asked her what she came to understand about justice and what we should understand about justice from those parts of her journey and your journey. And this is what she said.
Yes, an all-white jury acquitted Angela in 1972. And at the time we heard people saying afterwards that her acquittal is proof that our system of justice works. My view, of course, was that the acquittal demonstrated not the strength of our legal system, but the power of the people. We were able to organize an international movement powerful enough to stay the hand of the most powerful people in this nation who were bent on silencing her. The gifted team of lawyers certainly played a role here. And Margaret and others on the team inspired me to go to law school. All along, I remained active in all the major social justice movements, whether to free political prisoners, end racial violence, express solidarity with national liberation movements, and an anti-war women's liberation, anti-racism, and economic justice movements. After almost 3 decades of fighting injustice on multiple fronts, in the courtrooms and in the streets, I was filled with rage against Birmingham, against white supremacy, racial terror, the loss of my friends in the church bombing, the shooting of my husband, the attempted execution of my sister, and the loss of so many comrades to incarceration or death. I literally got sick, and I was burned out from the fires of rage and from the hyper-rational, hyper-masculinist, aggressive energies that I was compelled to cultivate to be successful as a trial lawyer and as an activist. I intuitively knew that I wouldn't come back into balance until I invited more healing and spiritual energies into my life. Synchronicity and dreams led me to a PhD program that allowed me to study with Indigenous healers in Africa. When I returned from Africa and finished the PhD in the early 2000s, I learned about restorative justice. It was a game changer. This new but old way of thinking about and doing justice. A justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal. A justice that is not about getting even, but about getting well. A justice that is a healing ground, not a battleground. A justice that creates social peace instead of deepening social conflict. It wasn't lost upon me that Dr. Martin Luther King saw justice in very similar ways when he said, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." And Cornel West said, "Justice is love expressed in public spaces." Learning about restorative justice was also life-changing because it allowed me to continue being the champion for justice I've always been. And it allowed me to embrace the newly emerging inner healer. Though the two seemed opposites in neocolonial ways of knowing, in binary and indigenous ways of thinking, where the structure of reality is inherently interrelated, they were not. I could be both warrior and healer at once. I co-founded a national restorative justice organization. I also co-founded Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth to promote restorative justice policies and practices in schools and juvenile justice systems. With a heartbreaking rise in gun violence, we also work to promote community wellness and violence prevention and intervention. Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth is widely viewed as a thought leader in pioneering the practice of restorative justice through a racial justice lens and in ways that honor its Indigenous roots.
So Margaret, your work has also sought to look back and seek justice for communities, for people impacted, particularly through the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice program. And I wonder what the path from 1972 to there has had you come to understand about what justice requires.
So thank you for the question, and thank you, Fania, for that wonderful answer to the question. Let me say first of all, we're now in 1972. We've skipped over a really critical decade, which was referenced by Angela in the U.S. experience, which is the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And I say that because once we pass through an epoch, we basically take it for granted. Oh yeah, we had a civil rights movement.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a civil rights movement, limited though it may have been, incomplete though it may be, you're in a very different situation. And I would just hold up as an example a country like Brazil, which has very similar racial apartheid conditions in Brazil, similar anti-black, institutional and structural reality, they never had a civil rights movement. They didn't have a civil rights movement. They didn't have this moment of upsurge and engagement and challenge to the status quo that we had here, which is not to say that the civil rights movement revolutionized our lived experiences, but it did get rid of Jim Crow, which is pretty significant. And it did, it created important ruptures and discontinuities in the subordinated and violent conditions under which African Americans were living. And so so let me just put that out there before we get to 1972. And I will just say, because I know our time is short and we have a whole other couple of decades to cover, that for me, the work that I currently do, which looks back at the decades of the 30s and 40s, and begins to make a serious accounting of what violence, and here I mean physical violence, not the material violence that is inherent in capitalist structures, that is, that holds together, that is the glue behind the capitalist structures in which we all live and for which we all pay. I don't mean that. I'm really talking about the physical violence, which is as well critical to the perpetuation of these structures. But I began to look at that because following along the discussion we had earlier, I don't think I really understood what our parents had gone through in the 1940s. I didn't know that period. The games, maybe, that sort of thing. But I didn't really know what it was like to live as an African American in the South. And we had sort of passed through that deeper exploration of what it was like during those years by beginning to talk, as well we should, about the new Jim Crow. And the and mass incarceration and its legacies in the old Jim Crow. And I felt, we don't really know the old Jim Crow. We need to go back and begin to look really carefully at what daily life was like for people like Captain Butler, one of the men in my book, who was a labor leader outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and because of his participation in the labor movement was shot and killed. We need to go back and look at what life was like, not just what the violence, which I say is so integral to the systems that pertained at the moment, but as well what the resistance looked like. And so that's my work involving my students, because it took not a village, but really an army to get this work done, was really to begin to name the names, recreate the places, visit the places, and tell the stories, so that we would really, really understand. Today's not the same as yesterday, but we need to understand how we got to today, and for that we have to look at yesterday. Mm-hmm. Let me just say before Andrew goes, which is the other thing I just want to convey is, for me, each generation is responsible for making sure that the stories that came before them that are still accessible get carried on in history. And that's why I sort of looked at this period. This is my parents' generation. There are people still alive who know about this, who know about the resistance. If we don't focus on that, history, we lose history. We lose the history of our resistance. And that is a precious thing.
So in this period, you were looking at the new Jim Crow and the reality of mass incarceration and really taking that up, as you said, after the end of the trial.
Well, it didn't happen so seamlessly. Often when we reflect on history, we think of history as linear, and we forget that there are stops and there are starts, and then there are contradictions, and so I knew once my trial was over that I was going to spend a great deal of time focusing on issues of imprisonment. I didn't realize that I would spend the rest of my life doing that, but I did know that I felt an obligation to do that work, precisely because so many people from literally all over the world had joined the campaign to free me. And so when the victory occurred, we partied. Somebody brought a whole case of champagne. We danced. We celebrated. But then Charlene Mitchell, whose name should be more widely recognized than it is, who was basically the person who held the whole movement together, the whole structure together. She and I had talked, and we said, we cannot end this with a victory celebration, because of course we won that victory and we wanted to acknowledge it, but what about all of the others who still deserve the same kind of attention? And so we had a meeting. We partied one night. We got up the next morning, and we had a meeting designed to figure out how to harness all of that energy and use it in a progressive way to free more people. Initially, we thought about it as a process of freeing more people, but as was pointed out in the wonderful narration, we had a great deal of discussion during the time I was in jail about the issue of the institution of the prison, and that we had to go beyond campaigns for individuals, for political prisoners, but we had to look at the institution of the prison as one of the most dramatic examples of what we would call structural racism today. And so we created an organization called the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which dealt with a whole range of issues, including the structural character of prison racism, if I would use the language that we use today. It took a while to get to abolition. And when I said things don't happen so neatly, I can remember being introduced to abolition when I was in jail in 1971, shortly after George Jackson was assassinated at San Quentin, and when the uprising at Attica took place. That was the very first time I had heard the term abolition used in connection with the problems of the prison. So that's in 1971. I could describe my own trajectory. It would be, but to to abbreviate it, I would say that I was teaching at San Francisco State, and someone asked me if I would teach a course on incarcerated women. Because one of the things I had recognized was that we were doing work against the prison and in support of political prisoners. And I would say probably even the majority of us were women, but we had imagined those issues, that constellation of issues, as being around men. And so it's interesting because I'm thinking about the way Fania talked about hyper-masculinity and how she dealt with it. And I had a similar kind of coming to consciousness about the masculinist character of the prison and the prison movement, but it took a while to figure it out. And that came through teaching. At first I said, I didn't think I could do that because the experiences were too raw and too emotional for me. But then I read all of the literature that I could find at the time. I decided to combine a class I was teaching at San Francisco State University on incarcerated women with teaching women in the San Francisco County Jail. And Fania, as a matter of fact, was a part of that project. And what I can say now is I believe I learned so much more from the women I taught than they learned from me. And one of the reasons why I'm one of those people who is constantly advocating for not only for education of people in prison, but for educational exchanges, because I think oftentimes people in prison are, with their lived experience and the ways in which they engage in intellectual work, can help us to do the work that we need to do to repair this society. And let me say that, if it hadn't been for George Jackson and others, I don't know whether we would have begun to think then about the structural role that the prison plays in producing and reproducing racism. There is so much more that people who have spent years and sometimes decades of their lives behind bars have to offer. And so I would respond by saying that by the time a group of us figured out how to begin to shift the narrative around prisons, and we came up with the term prison industrial complex, which we borrowed from Mike Davis, and I want to thank Mike Davis. And I don't know if you've read his work, but he was an absolutely an amazing scholar, organic, intellectual, and I'm referring to Mike because he just, what is today, Wednesday?
Yeah.
He just passed yesterday. So read his work if you have the opportunity. But he had used the term prison industrial complex in connection with what was happening to the economy of the state of California, the transition from an agricultural economy to a prison-based economy. And we decided, we told him we wanted to borrow his term, of course, that we would try to use this term to urge people to think differently about this institution, which many people saw as simply the inevitable consequence of of crime. You do the, what's the...
Do the crime, you do the time.
You do the crime, you get the time, you do the time. And we wanted, what we saw ourselves as doing is disarticulating that assumption that imprisonment is the inevitable consequence of crime. Excuse me. So we wanted to point out that people are in prison not because they commit crimes, although they certainly commit what we call crimes, but the reason why they're in prison, largely speaking, is because they're black, because they're working class. If they're white, they're working class and they're poor. And that we had to begin to think about how the prison actually structures the larger society. And we eventually held a conference that was called Critical Resistance in 1998. And that was, I think, the first abolitionist gathering that took place. And it still took a very long time before people would, people would think we were out of our minds. I mean, I can remember going to Harvard, giving a talk, and Henry Louis Gates had invited me. And the theme of the talk was abolition, prison abolition. And he said something to me like, "Girl, are you out of your mind?" And then later on, when he was arrested, right? Going into his own house, he said he completely reconsidered the arguments that I was making in that talk. But yeah, I'll just say it's been a really interesting journey, and those of us who were involved in that process are absolutely still today amazed that it was possible to begin to shift the dominant narrative. I mean, that's what we saw ourselves doing, but we didn't think we were going to do it. You always strive for something that is far beyond the realm of possibility. And I just want to say that with all of those people who have been involved in those campaigns, doing the work, repeating it, even when it did not seem as if it was making a difference, and then something happens. We get the experience of a pandemic, and we begin to see that Indigenous people and Black people and Latinx people are suffering more consistently than anyone else. We begin to talk about structural racism in that context, and people finally begin to recognize that racism is not just about one person having ideas about another person that are biased. It's not just about the way people think about each other. There's something deeply embedded in institutional systems. And then George Floyd is killed, is lynched by the police, and Breonna Taylor. And then suddenly, for a moment, it begins to click. And abolition becomes a part of the everyday conversation. Of course, there's been a lot of efforts to push that back now. But the point that I want to make is that people, grassroots organizers, have been struggling for that for decades. And I've been a part of that struggle for at least 50 years. And finally, when you recognize, as Margaret pointed out, that seeds were planted and sometimes they sprout. Now, sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. and it becomes apparent that all of the work that we do, all of the complaining that we do about people not changing and people not being able to understand, that actually sometimes, as Margaret pointed out, it takes a while for those seeds to find the right conditions. But when they do, you recognize that this is what you should have been doing all along. Even if you did it for 50 years without anybody really acknowledging it. Sometimes it takes 50 years, sometimes it takes 100 years, but this is exactly, what we need to be doing.
You have anticipated the last era, which is the here and now, and a reflection on what do we make of these journeys. So I'll let you set that up for us, and we'll hear Fania and move to some final thoughts before we allow some questions.
Our contemporary times call for the capacious and rigorous work of these panelists. Their work represents and supports the broader movement to resist colonialism, anti-Blackness, carcerality, and other forms of oppression by identifying their historical roots, protesting their ongoing systemic impact, and working concretely to build our ever-changing vision of freedom. This process has been taken up in present day by the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2013, the hashtag Black Lives Matter was used in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, an American man who fatally shot Trayvon Martin, a black 17-year-old boy. The hashtag, created by Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, grew into a decentralized movement that sought to develop the principles and goals that activists could use to resist anti-Black violence in their communities. The movement grew further in 2014 after the murder of Michael Brown by police officer Darren Wilson, resulting in the Ferguson uprising. During the peak of COVID-19, which brought the intersecting injustice of racism, classism, gender-based discrimination to the fore once again, George Floyd was murdered by police officer Derek Chauvin, sparking a global protest against police violence and the systems that require Black death and the policing and repression of Black life.
The panelists, from their childhood to the present day, demonstrate to us that there are legacies of resistance to draw upon as we continue to refuse the oppressive logics of anti-Blackness, colonialism, capitalism, and carcerality. Margaret's work reminds us that the violence we are resisting is precedented, and that a culture of anti-Black violence is perpetuated through our existing systems. But we need not despair, as she demonstrates to us that the persistent harms of the past can be reckoned with systemically at the scale of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and interpersonally through the stories that we tell about ourselves and our communities. Fania's efforts to remind us that the day-to-day work we do in our communities to shift away from our punitive responses to wrongdoing contributes to the widespread refusal of carcerality that can change the futures of the youngest among us. Her example also tells us that the work of collective healing lies first in the healing of our own bodies, spirits, and minds, a site of struggle that calls us to relate to ourselves beyond the ways of being that oppress us all. And finally, Angela teaches us that we must balance the urgency of justice work with a patient's understanding that freedom is not a fixed place where we might arrive. Freedom is grasped in the moments that we collectively construct alternatives to the systems that oppress us. But freedom eludes us as the act of holding it, briefly, allows us to imagine our next vision of a future in which we are free.
So we wanted to give you a chance, as you've thought back through your journey and helped us think from that journey as we are going to journey forward and must journey forward, to have a chance to reflect on what some of those seeds are and those lessons are that we need to grow. And we asked Fania that question.
The learnings have been plentiful on this lifelong journey of justice seeking. First, from our beginnings in Birmingham all the way to the present, justice has been a collective, not solitary pursuit. All that I did then, all that I do now, whether restorative justice, truth process, or anti-racism work, I do in deep collaboration with communities, with collectivities. Also, we advance justice through building movements. This principle has been with me over my lifetime, whether civil rights in Birmingham, freeing Angela and other political prisoners, advancing restorative justice, or furthering abolition and Black Lives Matter in the nation. Though I've built organizations of even greater importance to me is building movements. This communitarian ethos arises from an Indigenous sensibility. And the ancients say that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Second, as the great Black speculative fiction writer Octavia Butler has said, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. As I left the South, new experiences opened to me and I opened to them. My justice ideas changed and expanded. I changed, and this is what that looked like. Growing up in Birmingham, justice meant freeing my people from the yoke of racial terror and racial apartheid. Going up north to go to school, I saw racism wasn't just a Southern thing. It existed up north too, though there it was more hidden. Justice therefore expanded, in my mind, to include freeing Black people both down south and up north from both de jure and de facto discrimination. Traveling later to California, I realized that Black people weren't the only oppressed people. Justice then expanded to encompass liberation for Indigenous peoples and people of color, subjugated by imperialism worldwide. I later learned about gender oppression, and so the tent of justice again enlarged to include freedom from systems of heteropatriarchy. Continuing the journey, I became aware of class exploitation, and so justice expanded to include emancipation of all working people exploited by capitalism worldwide. When I traveled to Africa to learn from Indigenous healers, and when I learned about restorative justice, I came to understand that ultimately, justice invites an evolutionary shift of consciousness. We carry justice in our bodies, in our bones, and this means reimagining what it means to be human when we reimagine justice. This is the internal work of justice. We will no longer reproduce carceral and harmful ways of being when we do this work. We will be present to one another in ways that bring wholeness, holiness, and healing to one another, to ourselves, and all of the earth and her inhabitants. Third, in this time of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, we see the eruption of scores and scores of truth and reconciliation and reparations and reimagining initiatives. At bottom, these developments are urgent pleas to imagine a more capacious justice that can reckon with historical harm and its legacies. Our current system certainly can't. Prevailing justice desperately needs reimagining because it is rooted in slavery, convict leasing, racial terror, apartheid. From its very beginnings and continuing into the present, our quote, justice, end quote, system itself has been a perpetrator of untold harm. How can we let the fox guard the chicken coop? Also, carceral justice is designed to address individual harm only, and ineffectively and inequitably at that. We know racial harm. We know today that racial harm is systemic in nature. Also, in accusing, adjudicating, and sentencing individuals, the current system responds to the original harm with additional harms that only replicate and reproduce harm. What about repair? What about healing? Plus, our criminal legal system looks backward to punish people for past harm only. What about stopping recurrence of future harm? What about creating harm-free futures? Our system can't do it. Doesn't even try to. True justice means a holistic justice that recognizes harm, takes responsibility for harm, repairs harm, and prevents recurrence of harm. A forward-looking justice that sets its sights on stopping racial terror and creating new futures where Black and people of color lives matter. Restorative justice informed truth processes rooted in anti-racial capitalist, anti-heteropatriarchal values, and in Indigenous wisdoms about humanity, collectivity, responsibility in the earth are our North Star.
So I'm going to invite you each to make a short comment about which there's so much to say, but we have questions coming for you that ask you where we go now. But a short comment as you hear that about looking back at the journey and thinking about the journey ahead of all of us. What lessons, what learnings, what instructions about what justice is going to require of us and how to travel that way. Margaret, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I just want to say ditto to that elegant and eloquent. She, by the way, she did have a chance to edit what she said.
She didn't edit that. She did take a couple takes.
Yeah,
she didn't edit that.
But it was beautiful, and it said it all. Here's what I think. I think we're obviously, this is a moment to recognize what the difference is between the place we are in now and the place we were in, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And as far as our sort of understandings and perceptions and struggles around justice are concerned. And so here's what I'd say. One is we have moved away from the victim-perpetrator dyad that has forever defined our justice system to understand that a true justice system has to place the victim-perpetrator in a larger structure to fully understand what that relationship is all about and what the relationship means to a broader and more complicated society. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that our understandings of justice, we have to acknowledge and recognize how our understandings of justice have been immersed in, influenced by, and inspired by a feminist ethos, as Fania put it, an anti-patriarchal ethos, and an ethos that is fully embracing of the broad array of sexual and gender expression in our world today. And so that too, I think, has to define and anchor what it is we think about when we think about justice. Thirdly, I would say that because of the work that all of you have done around restorative justice and what our Smithsonian Institute in the United States calls restorative history, we need to think about justice as dependent on a range of knowledge practices. Not just those that come in the classrooms that Jennifer and I teach at the law schools, but knowledge practices that come from a broad array and locales where people have bring to bear different experiences and different depths, different philosophies, different perspectives, and different values about what, so that any justice system worthy of the name has to figure out how to incorporate all of that in its understanding of justice. And then the final thing I would say is this, and I learned this really from my work on the bench, is that the state can't own the justice system, but the state has to be involved and will be involved in some way. Now, we get, at some point, at some level, obviously, we, all of us collectively through our struggles, get to define what the state is. That's really ambitious, but let me put it out there. But you know, our system of justice has to be a partnership between organizations that are close to the ground, autonomous organizations of struggle, who are trying to improve the lives that we all live, especially the lives of those of us who are not privileged, those organizations and the state. And there has to be a working partnership. And certainly restorative justice leans in that direction, but we also have to make sure that the new sort of new frameworks, new containers in which we describe our work around justice don't get overtaken by the state. And that too is a challenge. So that striking that balance is those of us who are public defenders or prosecutors or in some way working in state institutions that call themselves justice-oriented, but that fall short. That we have to figure out ways in which those partnerships can be made to work until abolition.
Until abolition.
Well, so much has been said, and I think, perhaps I'll take up where Margaret left off, until abolition. And I guess I don't know whether there will be an until abolition. I think what I want to offer as we close this part of the conversation is some philosophical insight on the ways in which we often conceptualize justice. One of the things that we began to say about abolition early on is that we have to broaden our vision. It's not just about this institution. It's not primarily about the police dealing with this institution. It's not primarily about the prison dealing with that institution. It's about rethinking the entire society in such a way that allows us to imagine living without the need of such repressive institutions. So it's not primarily about getting rid of the prison. It's about asking the question, what would our society have to be like in order for us not to have to rely on such institutions as Child Protective Services, the police, prison, border police. And so what I would like to say is that justice is an infinite journey, that it will go on and on. And we often, talk about creating justice for the humans who inhabit the planet. And we forget about justice for the planet and all of its inhabitants, human and non-human alike. And so I think that I would like to suggest that we think more capaciously, that word has been used several times, more expansively, and that we learn how to imagine what is unimaginable now. How to imagine the possibility of what we might not be able to imagine now. And justice is going to acquire being, attentive to all of the non-human animals that cohabit this planet along with us. We often think we have such an anthropocentric vision that we think if we make things right for human beings, if we create justice for all humans, then we've done the work. And at the same time, the planet continues to deteriorate. Species become extinct. Monsanto and similar, groups like that colonize, all of the seed on the planet, and sometimes it's dizzying to have to think that way. And you understand what I'm saying? But I think that justice requires us to be attentive to that which we don't know how to be attentive to. And I want to close by evoking the Indigenous practice of asking questions about the impact of what we do today on humans and non-humans and plant life generations, 7 generations into the future. So that if we learn how to imagine what impact the work we do today may have on those who come long after we are gone, then that is a vision, I think, that will help us generate the kind of justice for the future. And I just want to say that I learned so much for listening to some of the residents of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children and the project that Jennifer has been involved in, and we have to think. We have to compel ourselves to imagine the future, even though we may not be imagining it the way that it will actually unfold, but only by imagining possible futures can we, I think, generate the kind of justice that will help all of us, human and non-human alike, move into the future. Thank you.
This has been such an incredibly rich chance to hear from you in conversation. We asked some people who are in the front row in the audience who are connected to the organization that helped organize tonight in conjunction with their own justice work to ask you some questions, and I know we're over time. So I thought what we might do is play them all and offer you the chance to pick up on some of the questions they asked and know that they're here.
As former residents of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, we formed the group Voices, victims of Institutional Child Exploitation Society, to support one another and advocate for a just response to experiences of abuse at the home. The restorative inquiry of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children was established out of that vision and commitment of Voices. As we former residents gathered to support one another, we used a wooden carving at Sankofa as a talking piece to ensure everyone had a chance to be heard. Sankofa stands for the idea that it is not taboo to go back and fetch that which you have forgotten. The symbol is based on a mythical bird, which is feet planted firmly forward and its head turned backwards with the egg in its mouth. The egg is knowledge. This symbolizes it is wisdom in learning from the past, which ensures a strong future. The symbol of this talking piece reflected the former residents' vision of the way forward on what they described as their journey to light, reflecting their commitment to bring to light what had happened to them in the past and to move forward out of this darkness and toward the light of a better future. We former residents were committed to a different way forward that would do no further harm, leave no one behind, and listen to the voices of those affected. Former residents wanted what happened to them to matter so that it would not happen to any other young people. They wanted to make a difference for the future, for young people and families in the African Nova Scotian community and across Nova Scotia.
During the inquiry, the former residents not only looked or took up the mantra, do no further harm and leave nobody behind, but we also invited people to join our journey to light. These ideas were reflected in all meetings held and engaged parties. Our process is different way forward, which is not about naming, blaming, or shaming anyone, but about looking at ways to recognize, discuss, evaluate, and share relevant concerns and ensure that all Black communities in Nova Scotia have their concerns heard and addressed at the grassroots levels. It is part of the former residents' larger and longer story of keeping a just response to the harms and abuse experienced at the home. Our question is, do you think that we should or could have managed our involvement in the restorative inquiry any differently? And if so, what would you suggest that we could have done differently? Thank you very much for your feedback.
Hello, my name is Annie Ogantona. I am a first-year law student at Dalhousie University. Before I ask my question, I want to take the time to thank the three of you for your scholarly work, for paving the way for the next generation of Black scholars, and advancing the language and tools that the Black community has to promote and pursue justice. Further, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this panel today. The question I have for you is, I am aware of your prison abolition beliefs. In conjunction with the theories of transformative justice, does that mean that you believe that all people are capable of reform? If not, then what does prison reform look like that incorporates transformative justice?
Hi, my name is Patricia White and I work for the Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland, Nova Scotia. I'm the first and only Indigenous peer support worker, as well as the residential manager. My question for the three of you is that we know there's a lot of work to be done in the area of justice transformation, but as I look at your journey and I see that so much of what you've done has been so successful, so I would be honored to learn from each of you of what you think your most successful strategy for justice transformation was and what you think that it was made so successful. Will Allen.
Hi, my name is Randolph Riley. I am a staff member with the East Coast Prison Justice Society on the monitoring project, where we answer calls from the provincial institutions where we assist prisoners with concerns about access to healthcare and other conditions and treatment in jail. I'm also a research assistant in the Black Studies Department at Dalhousie University, where I am currently working on a project involving access to healthcare for marginalized groups while in the prison system. During your last visit, Angela, in 2018, I was being held unjustly in the local county jail, where we organized a peaceful prisoner protest that you highlighted at your panel here in that same year. And we were all so grateful for that. Thank you. I also held a committee president position in a federal max penitentiary for a few years along my journey. Through a great friend of mine, Dr. L. Jones, I was granted the wonderful opportunity of writing you, in which I did, and your mentioning my community and church in your talk is a moment I cherish and sharing with others still to this day. I am doing all this while fighting a wrongful conviction that is back before the courts. And my question for you is based on your personal experience within the justice system. Although American, the systems sister one another in many ways. My question is for all of you, including Angela, who has been such a source of inspiration for me. In your journeys through the court system, including when fighting for Angela's innocence, what was it that kept each of you strong in the face of all the injustice one experiences at the hands of such an adversarial system? When we know we will never receive justice from the state or the province, knowing the system refuses to take accountability, how do we work for or even hold on to an ideal of justice? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan Rain. What role does intersectionality play in justice transformation and abolitionism? And in what ways can the criminal justice system transform and evolve to better support these intersectional ideals?
So there you go. That's that should be easy in the 3 minutes or less you each have.
Yeah, I'm just realizing we should have planned to do this for an entire week.
Yes.
Right?
Well, I think they'd come back, but you might have a flight.
Better weather.
Better weather.
Come back.
Less mist. Who would like to try first?
Well, I'll start with Tony's no shame.
No shaming, naming,
no
shaming, or
shame,
blaming.
no name, no shame, which I'm going to steal, by the way, and just say that that this is a failure of imagination, because I know that what a long process this was, and how deeply considered it was at all levels and among the many stakeholders who were involved, and I just can't imagine that it could have been done any other way. And I really appreciated the no shame, no name, no shame, no naming, no shaming piece of that. And as I heard Tony iterate that earlier today, I thought to myself, I need to retitle my book. The book is titled By Hands Now Known, which is about naming, but then I thought again, and I rescued the title, because it's about naming a system. It's not necessarily about naming an individual. It's about naming a system, which is not to deny that each of us is accountable for our participation, whether it's intentional, benign, or otherwise in the system. But it is about saying that, and we're not helpless in front of the system in terms of our actions. But I can't think of any other way that it could have been done. So I thank you, Tony, and Tracy, and all of you, Jennifer, and all of you who gave us that absolutely stunning example of justice.
Do you want to try one of the questions?
Well,
or all of them at once?
Maybe all of them at once, but I promise to be brief this time. And I actually am going to begin with the last question about intersectionality and how can the feminist strategy of intersectionality be helpful. Oftentimes people assume that when you use the term feminist, you're talking about a particular gender, you're talking about particular kinds of bodies. But I see the kind of anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism as a strategy that can be taken up by anyone, regardless of what their gender identity might be. And intersectionality is about thinking things together. It's about making connections, not only connections around gender, but to connections around class, around disability, around all kinds of conditions that define our lives. And it's an imperative not to be satisfied with simple answers. Mari Matsuda, whom both of you know because you're legal scholars, once said that you always have to ask the other question. Don't stop with asking a single question. So that if the issue is around race, ask the question about gender identity. If it's about class, ask the question about sexuality. Always ask the other question. And I think that is how I would answer the other questions as well. By saying, always ask the other question. And finally, recognize that there is much to be learned from our mistakes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. We learn more from our mistakes than we do from the things we do correctly from the outset. And so that is I think a kind of imperative to be experimental, to be creative, to imagine new journeys. And so I would say to Tony that your journey is a journey from which you can draw many, many lessons. There are other possible journeys, but don't be afraid to take the one because it might not be the right one. Learn from all of your journeys, and finally, that means that those of us who are older, and that happens to all of us, by the way. It's not a natural, it's not a state of being. It's a process. It will happen to all of you. No matter how young you are, you will one day be older, and you recognize that younger people are often the ones who offer us the most creative ideas, who are often the ones who are most willing to take risk, and most willing to fly into the future, and that is something we all need. And so I always ask myself, whether I am as attentive to the ideas of younger people as I would like them to be. I would actually like to be even more attentive to those ideas than they are attentive to me, because I think, I feel like I've repeated myself so many times that it's all out there already anyway, and all of the new exciting ideas are coming from the younger generations, and that is the way towards the future.
Are you good? So I'll ask Lindsay to come back out and close our evening with a thanks.
Wow. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here this evening when I say what an honor and a privilege to be in the presence and to listen to such powerful first voice accounts. These stories are so important, and I know this came up already, but thank you for giving them a home, through books and documentaries and films. We have to keep telling and sharing these stories, as you said, because they're just so important. So I'm going to be brief, but thank you to our panelists for your incredible contributions, your truth-telling, not only tonight, but throughout your transformative life journey for racial justice. I stand on your shoulders, so thank you. And if you would like to learn more, from Angela, Fania, or Margaret, then I encourage you, if it's still there, to check out King's Co-op bookstore just outside the theater, where you'll find signed copies of the panelist books. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this incredible evening. Please get home safe, and good night.